Good day, and today we're going to have an introduction into a time period of literature called the Cavaliers and the Puritans. We're looking around the 17th century, about 1625 to 1700 in Great Britain. First, when we look at the religious and political point of view, we do see quite a bit of turmoil. There's a lot of turnover when it comes to who is in charge. For example, when Queen Elizabeth I dies in 1603, she doesn't leave any specific heirs to the throne. She was unmarried all of her life. So she asks a relative, King James from Scotland, to come and rule over both Scotland and England. And he does from 1603 to about 1625. And then King Charles will rule over Scotland and England from about 1625. And with his exile, we'll say to about 1649. But of course, during that time period, you do see the English Civil War. And so Oliver Cromwell is credited for having this political turmoil about 1642 to 1660. And we see the restoration to the throne in 1660 with King Charles II from about 1660 to about 1685. Now, what is there such controversy about that we would see an English Civil War coming in, that people don't know who should be ruler next? Well, it even goes back before Queen Elizabeth, and that is the major controversy of religion. The royal family are Anglican Catholic sympathizers overall, while the common people have been Protestant sympathizers. And so there's a lot of fight up on the top about what the Church of England should look like. Should we allow Catholicism and Anglican to live together in peace? Should the whole country be one specific religion? And then which religion is that? Now, this is also a time period where they still believe that there is a divine right of kings, where the king is head of both the church and the state. And so this is where the controversy starts cracking under pressure. So we take a look at King James. He wasn't exactly a picture of health. He had crippling arthritis, weak limbs, digestive problems, the gout, he had difficulty walking, he had tongue problems, and after numerous attempts on his life, he just required constant care. He's not the type of person that you would expect to be in charge of a head of state. Now, there are some good things that he did. Not only was he ruler of Great Britain at the time, he also invented the current British flag. He combined England's Red Cross of St. George with Scotland's White Cross of St. Andrew. However, he didn't quite help when it came to religious nonconformity. I mean, he tried. We do have the King James's version of the Bible today, but we start seeing these break-offs in religious factions. We have the separatists, the Puritans, who decide to go off first to Holland and then to the United States. We see Congregationalists and Presbyterians breaking away from the more English Anglican church government styles. We see the differences in the changing of time, whether or not you rely more on your congregation or your parish versus the reliance of a bishop telling you what to do. And then, is your particular parish or your particular congregation going to work with liturgical versus non-liturgical rites? So with King James and the Non-conformists, he once said, quote, "I shall make them conform themselves, or I will harry them out of the land, or else do worse." So you had better follow the head of church and state, what the king tells you to do with your religion, or you have to get out of England. Next, we have King Charles I. And he angers just about anybody who comes into contact with him. And this is why, of course, he's probably going to lose his head later on in life. First of all, he angers the Parliament. As head of state, he believes that he should have full rights over the state in the Parliament. He also angers people like the Puritans and other nonconformists to him being head of the church. And so because of this, there's beginning to see almost a private faction that is helping King Charles with his private arrests, trials that simply go nowhere. We already know that the people are going to be found guilty and hung, drawn and quartered, decapitated. We see lots of non-conformist and a lot of revolutionary tendencies starting to build up in the beginning of his reign. Now, we also see him worshiping the Catholic religion as the high church, which becomes the last straw for the common folk. Presbyterian Scots and their new liturgy as well were not very pleased that Catholicism was becoming the high church once again. And that's where we see the English Civil War, or the Bloody Revolution. King Charles will be beheaded in 1649 by a bunch of different people getting together, such as the Puritans, who are known as the Roundheads. We also have the Cavaliers, the Royal Loyalists, who try to come to his aid. Now, there is a council of state that is set up that is backed by revolutionary officers once King Charles is dethroned, and Cromwell assumes control as Lord Protector of the Commonwealth. Under Cromwell's rule, we see a Puritan strictness. Now, we are going back to a more Protestant religion, but we are heading way over to the left side where everything is following exactly what you are told in the Bible to do. And he backs it up with military power. After all, he's now head of the state. He's now head of the state in England and Scotland. And so if you wanted to be Presbyterian, if you wanted to be Catholic, if you wanted to be something other than Puritan or Anglican, you better get out of the country, just like you were with King Charles. We also see a suppression of theater and other frivolous activities. Again, with the Puritan strictness, these were considered sins, and so therefore you wouldn't go out and find these more entertaining follies. And he becomes a bit of a dictator, a bit more of a tyrant when the commoners take a look at his rule. Now, Cromwell's death is going to doom Puritan rule. Before, we had kings and queens who would have heirs to the throne, so you kind of knew when one died who would be taking over next. Or at the very least, if there was going to be one set of family who was going to be fighting in order to take over the royal family. But here, with Cromwell not having heirs or not having set up a way to elect some other Puritan leader in, Parliament then asks for King Charles back from exile in Holland. And people, quite honestly, were tired of the Puritan strictness and they wanted to revolt against it. So when Charles II becomes king again after his exile, he, as his father, was a Catholic sympathizer. And so we start repressing religious measures. Again, remember, they were under such a strict Puritan Anglican rule that if we're giving Catholics sympathies, we are going to start making more religious measures that ally a bit more towards the Catholic religion and the Pope. And certainly because Charles was hiding over in Holland and France, you see more of an alliance to Catholic France. This, again, is not what the common people of England wanted, and discontent grows versus the monarchy. When James II takes the throne in the 1600s, he is also a Catholic sympathizer, and he begins to appoint Catholics to influential government and military posts. And this is the first time after over 100 and so years that we see Vatican representatives in the court. You also see religious persecution of Scottish Protestants. So it's, again, we had to swing all the way to one side away from Catholicism and into Protestantism with Cromwell. And it's almost like the swinging back to the other side, where now we have a more Catholic country under first Charles II and even more so under James II. And so we are going to have a revolution once again, but this time it is considered the Bloodless Revolution. And that's because the next rulers that we have is James II's daughter Mary, who marries William of Orange, a Holland Protestant. Parliament asks them to rule in the place of James II. And so James II is dethroned and William and Mary take over. As they take over, since this was Parliament who asked them to do so, it was almost a contractual kind of obligation. And so you see a more limited monarchy from here on out. Now, at this time in the 1600s, you also see London growing to over 600,000 people. It is quite believably a huge city in Europe. It is becoming quite influential to help the British Empire, become quite an influence across the world. Now, of course, with that is going to come some destruction and some trials and tribulations. We do also see around this point in time with William and Mary the Great Plague in London about 1665, where over 68,000, perhaps more, die from the plague. Right after that, you also see the Great Fire of London in 1666, where there will be more deaths and more tragedy. But what we've really come here for is to take a look at the literary side of the 1600s. Throughout all these revolutions, throughout all these changes in monarchy, what is being written at the time? Well, let's start off with the Cavalier poets. If you recall, when we're starting into our first revolution, the Cavaliers are going to be these very Anglican royalists. And so they are supporters of the king. So when we take a look at poets such as Lovelace, Suckling, and Herrick, you look at their topics of wine, women, war, and love. People who have gone off to war, have journeys, have quests, and they're simple and easy to understand. Because they are supporters of the king, they also want to be sure that once the king is dethroned, that their poetry is read. So you're going to notice they have a tendency to avoid religious topics. For the most part, when you look at the Cavalier poets, you'll notice that they are satires. They're quite witty, and since they're simple and easy to understand, it looks like it's just written for the common man for pure entertainment purposes. Next, we'll look at the metaphysical poets. You have Herrick showing up once again into this period, but you also have the works of John Donne and George Herbert. Now, these are clearly Protestant writers. We didn't see a lot of religion with the Cavalier poets, but these poets will start bringing religion back into their writing. These are also poets who are not happy with the king. And so with the religious and philosophical topics, they are going to be challenging the idea of a church versus state. They're very demanding as to figuring out what philosophy or what religion, what is going to rule over man. And so you'll see a lot of symbolism being used in their poetry as well. And they're called metaphysical poets because of their metaphysical conceits. You're going to see some unusual metaphors that make you wonder what is being compared. Now, when we look at 17th century poetry, we have to mention one of the greatest poets at that time, and that is John Milton. And we look at his great work of over 10,000 lines, Paradise Lost. Now, from John Milton's point of view, this is a very Puritan look at fall into sin. And he's attempting to justify the ways of God to man. Another one of our great 17th century poets would be John Dryden. He is the poet laureate of Charles II. Now, he writes more in a neoclassical style. You're going to be seeing more satires coming from him. He's after the Cavalier poets, but he will also be writing satires and odes, basically to entertain the population. But he didn't just write poetry. He's also an essayist. He is known as the father of modern prose. He also was a debater and a translator. And what he's known a lot for is his literary criticism of other works of art coming out at this time. Moving over to 17th century drama, we look at Ben Jonson's works, specifically his comedies. Because the Puritans are closing the theater, he wasn't as well known or popular at the time he was coming out, but he certainly becomes more popular after the Puritans and Cromwell leave. Because his comedies, again, were written for entertainment purposes. He has the Comedy of Manners being written at this time, which is going to bring in a whole new era of drama. With the satires that are very popular during this time with poetry and with prose, you're going to see satiric comedy also coming into drama, and even a tragic comedy, which kind of feels a little bit like today's soap operas. And by the end of the 17th century, for the first time in Great Britain, actresses are acceptable on the stage. Now, when we move to 17th century prose, you're going to run the gamut of everything. Remember, London has grown into a big, busy center of Europe, and as the British Empire is establishing itself across the world, you're going to see writers come into the foreground. For example, the philosophical writings of Hobbes and Locke are going to be studied for centuries afterwards. The scientific writing, as we start seeing a more age of reason coming into play with the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. John Dryden's literary criticism is going to bring literature a little bit more upscale. People are going to start competing and wondering, how do we improve? The King James's Bible has also been written during this century, and it is going to be revised and renewed and become a mainstay of the work in the Anglican Church. And we have other great writers such as Isaac Walton writing The Complete Angler. John Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress comes out. You have the Diary and Code being written by Samuel Pepys. Lots of different genres of 17th century prose are starting up our more modern era of prose. Now, when we take a look at one of the writers, such as John Bunyan at this time, we can see some of the works that we know from today in their very early stages. Matter of fact, when I read this particular poem to you, I'm wondering if it will sound familiar. Our Father, which in heaven art, thy name be always hallowed. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, thy heavenly path be followed. By us on earth as 'tis with thee we humbly pray, and let our bread us given be from day to day. Forgive our debts as we forgive those that to us indebted are. Into temptation lead us not, but save us from the wicked snare. The kingdom's thine, the power too, we thee adore. The glory also shall be thine for evermore. Now, Bunyan was writing Pilgrim's Progress in prison, and his main character is Christian, and we take a look at Pilgrim's Progress as an allegory of Christian life. Again, we talked about Pilgrim's Progress being this foray into sin, looking at what sin is and how we can possibly avoid it later. And a lot of people at this time period held up John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress as the last great Christian classic. When we move on to the diary writing, when we start looking into more journals, one of the earliest writers that we have this is Samuel Pepys. And for example, when we take a look at one of his diaries for June 15th, he writes, "The Duke of York not yet come to town. The town grows very sickly, and the people be afeard of it. They're dying this last week of the plague, 112, from 43 the week before, whereof one in Fanchurch Street and one in Broad Street by the treasurer's office." Now, lastly, if you're looking at 17th century prose, watch for spelling becoming set. At this time period, we start seeing the first dictionaries become real. As we've been mentioning throughout poetry, throughout the comedies, throughout prose, satire becomes a very entertaining piece in the 17th century Great British literature. So satire is a moral writing to expose evil. With religion and political turmoil, satire becomes the way of expression in the 17th century. We also see the rise of comedies as we have a bit of the 17th century where we cannot have any theater at all. People are looking for escapist literature, so there will be a rise of comedies. You also get the heroic couplet in poetry. We're not yet quite ready to start looking for Byronic heroes or others in our stories of prose, but the heroes are going to start making their way into our poetry and into our literature. And lastly, remember, this is just after the time period of William Shakespeare, and so at this time, William Shakespeare is considered a rough, uncultured author, and he's not often performed. Thank you so much for stopping by to learn about Cavaliers and learning about the Roundheads, and as well as learning about 17th century literature. If you'd like me to cover any of these in particular, like if you'd like to learn more about John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress or Dryden, let me know in the comments who I can cover for you. And as always, I'd appreciate it if you subscribed. Take care.